All right. Another thing that we can do during our voir dire moments with our jurors is we can expose their case-specific bias. Now, again, I don't know your case. Each one of our cases is different, but every case does have a bias. And not the easy ones like race or gender or the things that are big, but the little ones, the little biases. And you've got to expose them. And then you deal with them and you confront them and say, you realize that you will be biased to look at this evidence differently just because he's been accused of looking at child pornography. You know we disagree with that. That's why we're here. But your bias is going to be to look at him and say, well, no one would ever have child pornography on their computer, right? Well, that's a bias. So we're going to talk about that for a couple of minutes because we're going to tell you a different story. And all we're asking you to do is not let your bias overwhelm you. Because quite frankly, I agree with that bias. Until I listen to the story, then things changed. And by the way, bias is not necessarily good or bad. But bias does blind. It blinds us from the truth. I have a question. Who amongst us wants to be biased and would feel like we are good people if it was blinding us from the truth? Maybe I just switched a paradigm of yours. Consider that. It's not good or bad. It's just blinding to the truth. Now, fears are really important. And I mentioned this a few minutes ago. My slide came up and I kind of jumped ahead of myself. But I like in voir dire, opening and closing, to deal with my fears. And I'll tell you why. Because it is a moment to be authentic. And I have this deep belief. I don't have any evidence for this. This is just an opinion one, not supported. But that authenticity is what makes us great as lawyers. To be authentic in a courtroom and to be genuine is to be powerful. Even if it means we must acknowledge our fears. Because once we acknowledge them, they can be dealt with. They can be overcome. All right, let's move on to some comments about opening statement. And by the way, all those concepts were both opening and voir dire and close, but let's move on because I want to talk about some other things. Especially that book I showed you a few minutes ago suggests with tremendous amount of studies that juries prefer and process information in a storytelling mode. In other words, you've got to tell a coherent story that matches the facts. And if you don't tell them a story in a way that they can follow, they will fill the story in with their own facts and their own circumstances. You need to give it a setting, you need to have characters, you need to have a timeline. And most importantly, you need to remember now that one of your roles is the storyteller. And so, if you're not relatable, so your client is not relatable, you must be at least relatable, so that when you tell the story, it can be acceptable. Here's one of the problems in storytelling. And by the way, this isn't a criticism of prosecutors, but it is a criticism of prosecution techniques. Their characters tend to be very flat. If you think about the way they tell a story, it's very flat. The guy walked into the bar, he saw somebody, he punched him, blah, 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 blah. Then he saw the cute girl and he took her back, and because he's a bad man, he raped her. Right? Very flat. Okay? And they tell the stories that flat. And by the way, those are simple, flat stories that are easy for a jury to tack onto. But it's not good storytelling. Okay? Good storytelling gives our characters depth. And this is the way you have to dig into your clients' lives and find, you know what? The situation was, they were dating for 3 years. He was African American. She was white. They were having sex. She claimed that the very last time it was forcible, and that's the charge. Now it's real easy to say, he forced her. The flat characters, if you tell that story, the flat characters, it would be easy. He was angry, he was ticked off, he was this, that, and the other. It was the last time he forced her. The parents found out about it and they got mad and they went and told the police, and here we are in front of him and he's a rapist. Flat characters. But there's more to their lives than that. You're going to see that she was heartbroken, that her parents didn't want her to have this relationship anymore because they were from a different time where interracial marriages were not only inappropriate and frowned upon, they were embarrassing. And they are embarrassed. And so when they heard that that nice young black man had forced himself upon their daughter, they were embarrassed. And they began to build a story around their embarrassment.